Bonjour à tous and welcome to this video on the passé composé versus the imparfait. So I'm assuming that you're watching this video because you're having some difficulty distinguishing these two tenses. And if that's the case, do not worry, you're in the same boat as pretty much every other native English learner of French. This is perhaps the biggest difficulty that English speakers have with the French language. So if you're not understanding it all right now, do not worry. Everyone else has been there. Now before we begin, I want to bring up two things. Number one, this video is going to be quite long because there is a lot to get through. If, though, you don't feel like watching it all the way through, I've put some times in the description to help you navigate it a little bit more easily. And secondly, I'm not going to talk about conjugations in this video. So if you don't know how to conjugate the passé composé or the imparfait, you need to get comfortable with those first, because I haven't got time to go through it in this video. This video is for those of you who know the conjugations but aren't quite sure about how to use them. So I want to begin by telling you that the passé composé and imparfait do not have true equivalents in English. Both French and English have various past tenses, but they don't really map onto each other very well. So for example, you could say in English, I washed the car, and this in French could be translated using the passé composé, j'ai lavé la voiture, or the imparfait, je lavais la voiture. The problem is we just don't know enough about the nature of this action to know whether to use one or the other. French considers I washed the car ambiguous, and so we need to know more. What we need is context, and that is often the case in French. You hear me say that all the time, but it's true. We need to know more about this action in order to decide whether to use the passé composé or the imparfait. The good news is that there are some clues, particularly with the imperfect. For example, if in English you say used to do or was doing, then usually you'll use the imparfait. So for example, I used to go to school, j'allais à l'école. We used to play football, nous jouions au foot. They were talking to each other, ils se parlaient, and she was getting dressed, elle s'habillait. So in all of these, we're either talking about an habitual action, used to do, or an ongoing action, was doing. And they are two of the criteria for the imparfait, which is concerned with incomplete, habitual, or ongoing actions. So the expression was doing gives us a little bit more context. It tells us this action at the point in time that we're talking about wasn't finished yet. And used to do tells us that it was something that was done regularly in the past, i.e. it was habitual. The passé composé, on the other hand, is interested in individual completed actions, and we're going to have a look at that in a little bit more detail now. So let's take that sentence that we've just seen, j'ai lavé la voiture. The translations for this in English would be I washed the car, I have washed the car, and in certain circumstances even I did wash the car. But remember that these tenses don't match up quite in the same way, and so j'ai lavé la voiture carries information that the English sentence doesn't, namely that this is a single completed action as we've just seen, and also has a clear start and end point, i.e. starting to wash the car and then finishing washing the car. So we know that I'm no longer washing the car and it happened on just one occasion. You might want to visualize this on a timeline where we have the present tense in the middle and then j'ai lavé la voiture as a dot on that timeline. Okay, so it has a start and an end, it is over, and it only occupies that one space on the timeline. Let's compare that with the imperfect. So this sentence in the imperfect would be je lavais la voiture. The translations for this are numerous. We could have I used to wash the car, I was washing the car, I washed the car, and even I would wash the car. But the point is that this is either an incomplete action or an habitual one. So the sentence is still ambiguous. We do need further context to decide whether we're saying I used to wash the car or I was washing the car, but it's different to the one previously nonetheless. So again, if we look at that timeline, here we have j'ai lavé la voiture, our dot. If we're talking about an ongoing action, i.e. we're saying I was washing the car, Je lavais la voiture appears somewhere within that dot. We don't know where, okay? The exact time period, the exact length of the action is not important. We just know that at some point between starting to wash the car and finishing washing the car, something happened. I was washing the car and you got home, or something like that. If though we're talking about an habitual action, it just appears at some point in the past for an undefined period of time. So it could have started long ago and ended relatively recently. It could occupy the entire past. It could occupy a small part of the past. It could have started somewhere in the middle and ended somewhere in the middle. We don't know. The time period is undefined. The point is that this is something that used to happen in the past on a regular basis. We have to be particularly careful with the imperfect though, because in English we have several ways of expressing the same thing. For example, you can say, I washed the car every day when I was younger. You can say, I would wash the car every day. You can say, I used to wash the car every day. These all essentially mean the same thing. They are an habitual action, as we've just seen. In French though, they all use the imperfect, so don't be fooled by the wording. Je lavais la voiture tous les jours quand j'étais jeune. This is why literal translations are not good. I think the sentence which is most likely to trip you up here is I would wash the car every day, because would is often associated with a conditional, but this is not a conditional. We're not saying I would wash the car if I could. We're saying in the past I used to wash the car every day, and so therefore we'll use the imperfect. A good test, if you can replace it with used to without the meaning changing, use the imparfait. So now I have just a few pieces of advice from my perspective that might help you beyond just the simple rules. So first of all, if the time period is defined, you must use the passé composé. So take the sentence, I lived in France for 3 years. A lot of people learn that the imparfait is used for long periods of time in the past. But that's really not that helpful, because how long is a long time? In certain contexts, 3 years could be a really long time. For example, if I said, how long did it take you to sharpen your pencil? And you said 3 years, that's a long time. If though I said, how long did it take you to single-handedly build a space station? And you said 3 years, I'd be pretty damn impressed, because that's not very long. The point about the imparfait is not about the length of time, it's about whether that length of time is defined. If we know how long something lasted, i.e. in this case 3 years, then we use the passé composé. So you would say, j'ai vécu en France pendant 3 ans. There's a clear start and an end, i.e. the start of the 3 years and then the end of the 3 years, 3 years later. Then remember that the passé composé can be used for multiple actions in the past. I think sometimes the rule about the imparfait and a regular action in the past gives the impression that if something happens more than once, you should always use the imparfait. That is not the case. If you say how many times you did something, use the passé composé. For example, I washed the car 100 times. You may well have done that on a regular basis, but that's not what we're interested in here. The point is that I did 100 individual acts. Okay, that is 100 dots on that timeline, and therefore we use the passé composé. J'ai lavé la voiture 100 fois. So basically, if you say how many times you do something, or rather did something, use the passé composé. This is something that I found in doing a little bit of research for this video and found it quite useful. You can think of the imparfait and passé composé in the context of a story, where the imparfait describes, it sets the scene, and the passé composé narrates, it tells us what happened over time. So for example, you could say, it was raining. This is a description, you're setting the scene, you're telling us what was happening. Il pleuvait. Similarly, you could say, I was wet. Simple description. No time has passed. These are two things that happened at the same time. J'étais mouillé. If though you then say, I took out my umbrella, that is a definite action. It's something that happened, it finished, and time progressed. So, j'ai sorti mon parapluie. And similarly, I stepped in a puddle. Again, time has progressed. This is an action that has a start and an end. It is now over. So we say j'ai mis le pied dans une flaque. So that might be another way of looking at it, a slightly different angle that makes things a little bit clearer. There are also some déclencheurs, triggers, for one tense or the other. So there are some words mostly associated with the imparfait, and it kind of all makes sense based on the rules that we've seen. So for example, chaque semaine, each week or every week, that's a definite habitual action. D'habitude, usually, normally we did this, usually we would do that. Again, it's a clear habitual action. Le lundi, le mardi, le mercredi, le jeudi, etc. So if you put an article before a day of the week, it means every Monday, every Tuesday. Or rather, on Mondays, on Tuesdays. Again, it's something that happened regularly. Parfois, sometimes, and souvent, often, we would do this. Parfois, sometimes we would or we used to do this. Often we would do this, not one individual or two individual events, but just some ambiguous, we don't know how many times, just quite a lot. And tous les jours, again, it's kind of like chaque semaine or le lundi, le mardi. Every day, we used to do this. Similarly, we have expressions usually associated with the passé composé. So, une semaine, 1 week. So now we've got a very specific point in time. The same goes for un jour, 1 day. Again, that's even more specific. Lundi, mardi, so without the article this time, that just means on Monday. That's a very specific time. We know exactly what day. On Tuesday, on Wednesday, on Thursday, etc. We've seen this already. If you define the number of times, so X number of times, you're going to use the passé composé because you're talking about X number of individual events. So, une fois, deux fois, trois fois, 1 million de fois, 1 milliard de fois, doesn't matter how many times. If you specify that, use the passé composé. And then we have words like d'abord, first of all, and ensuite, then. So this goes back to that idea of a series of events. First, this happened. Then, this happened. Usually, when the imperfect is describing or setting the scene, time does not pass. If, though, you have an action, time, of course, has to pass for that. And so d'abord and ensuite usually introduce that aspect of time moving on. Now, if you've got to this stage and you're still not 100% clear, that is absolutely fine. I remember learning everything we've just gone through and still coming across some situations where I just wasn't sure. And I later found out that the most difficulty I was having was with stative verbs. Stative verbs, as the name suggests, are verbs that express some kind of state. And it can be difficult to know whether to use the passé composé here or the imparfait, because passé composé is all about actions that have a start and an end, and mental states don't necessarily have a start and an end, and they usually last a long time, and so we think, do I use passé composé, do I use imparfait? I just don't know. The thing to remember is that stative verbs can be used in the passé composé, but rather than saying this was a state, it happened and then it ended, they actually indicate a change of state, which we'll look at in more detail in a moment. But sometimes this change of state gives the verb a slightly different implicit meaning, and sometimes in English you may choose to translate the words differently to their sort of primary definitions. So we're going to look at some solid examples to make that a little bit clearer. We're going to look specifically at 8 stative verbs. They are croire, to believe, avoir, to have, être, to be, savoir and connaître, both to know, vouloir, to want, pouvoir, to be able, devoir, to have to. So I'm hoping that you're already familiar with the conjugations and meanings of these, at least the primary meanings, because they are very common verbs. All but one of them appear in my irregular verbs videos, because they are some of the most important verbs in French. And if you're not that familiar with them, like if you don't know the difference between savoir and connaître, I suggest that you familiarize yourself with them first before going into this kind of detail, because you need to know their basic meanings and their conjugations more than you need to know this. If you're happy with them though, let's get straight on with croire. So usually beliefs are a long-term thing, right? So most of the time we will use the imperfect when we're talking about belief in the past. So for example, you could say, I believe that Santa existed when I was little. This is a typical case of a used to, even though we haven't said it explicitly. You could equally say, I used to believe that Santa existed, and that in French would indeed use the imperfect. Je croyais que le Père Noël existait quand j'étais petit. So that's 3 wonderful examples of the imparfait there, perfect. That shouldn't be too difficult. Similarly, you could say, we thought that it was possible. So if this was a general belief in the past, then you will use the imparfait in the same way. So, on croyait que c'était possible. You could argue that there's a lack of context there and that we don't know, but generally, on croyait would work there. However, in the passé composé, we're talking about a belief which is short-lived or triggered by a specific event. So, for example, we could say, I thought you had said yes. So this isn't a belief that I'm living with, or even one that I lived with for very long. It is something that was triggered by you speaking. You spoke, I thought you said yes, and now because I've brought it up, I clearly don't believe that anymore. And so we'll say, j'ai cru que tu avais dit oui. We say tu avais dit oui here because we have an action which is in the past and then another action which is further in the past. It is the plus que parfait. Or you could say, that's what he told me, so I believed it. So you may well have believed it for a long time, but it was triggered by a specific event. He said this to you, and you believed it. Okay? And so we say, c'est ce qu'il m'a dit, one single action completed, donc j'y ai cru. At that point in time, I believed it. Now we move on to avoir, which in the imparfait indicates long-term possession. I've written possession, of course. Avoir isn't always used to talk about possession. You can use it to describe body temperature, to talk about age, but generally long-term things. So you could say, nous avions un chien qui s'appelait Milou. And that would be, we used to have a dog called Milou, right? That again is a relatively simple example. You could also say, j'avais 10 ans quand nous sommes allés au Canada. J'avais 10 ans. I was 10 when we went to Canada. So here it's not possession, but age. And I was 10. That was my state. Whatever stage of being 10 I was in, that was my age when we went to Canada. We only went to Canada once. That is over. Therefore, we use the passé composé in the nous sommes allés au Canada thing. But the important thing here is the j'avais 10 ans. In the passé composé, though, if you use avoir, it usually suggests a change from not having something to then having it. And so, as I said before, you might want to change the translation here from have to receive or get. So if you say, j'ai eu un chien qui s'appelait Milou, that wouldn't be, I had a dog called Milou at some point in the past. It's more like I received or I got a dog called Milou. I put the get translation in here because j'ai eu un chien, it's not informal, but it's not incredibly formal either. To say receive, you could say j'ai reçu un chien qui s'appelait Milou. That would be a little bit more sort of standard, a little bit of a higher register. J'ai eu un chien, while correct, is perhaps a little bit less formal. But that is the meaning. It's going from not having it to having it, i.e. receiving or getting. Likewise, j'ai eu 10 ans hier doesn't mean yesterday I was 10 and the day before I was also 10. This is, I went from not being 10 to being 10. So this translation would be, I turned 10 yesterday. And indeed, if you ever express an age using the passé composé, you're talking about becoming a certain age. Ah oui, Sophie, elle a eu ses 50 ans hier. So Sophie turned 50 yesterday. So then we move on to être, which has a few different meanings depending on the exact context. Generally, in the imperfect, it's used to describe a situation that may still exist. So you could say, ils étaient à Paris, which is, they were in Paris, and for all we know, they could still be there now. It doesn't have any connotation of, for all we know, they could still be there now. The point is that we're not concerned whether they're there now or not, just that at some point in the past, they were in Paris. It's a description, it's not the main action that happened, it's just, they were at some point in time in Paris. They could be there now, they might not, who knows, who cares. Similarly, tu étais ivre is you were drunk, and again, you could still be now, you might not still be now, it could have been a long time ago, it could have been yesterday. Again, it's not important, we're not worried about the exact time, just that at some point in the past, you were drunk. However, the passé composé changes être slightly, so with places, être kind of goes to mean went. So you were there and now you're not. So, ils ont été à Paris, literally, they have been in Paris, is more like they went to Paris. And now we know that they aren't there, because passé composé is completed action. So, ils ont été à Paris. Are they in Paris now? No. With the imparfait, we didn't know that. But with the passé composé, we do. This is a very informal way of saying ils sont allés à Paris. This is very, very common in the spoken language. Tu as été à Paris? Did you go to Paris? It's not so much have you been in Paris, but did you go? A more standard way of saying this would be ils sont allés à Paris, or tu es allé à Paris. In other cases where we're not talking about a place, the passé composé describes a situation which is now simply over. So, tu as été ivre is you were drunk, so the translation in English is the same as tu étais ivre. But now we know that you aren't anymore, and this is just one whole action. Remember, one dot on the timeline. So let's move on to savoir, which usually means to know, and in the imperfect describes one sort of general knowledge, the knowledge that you were at some point in the past living with. So, je savais qu'il s'appelait Jean. I knew that he was called John. So, at some point in the past, whatever point it may be, I knew that his name was John. There's really no further explanation to that one. Similarly, nous ne savions pas s'il avait menti is we didn't know if he had lied. This sentence doesn't tell me anything about whether I now know if he's lied. Okay, I still might be completely ignorant to his lying. I don't know. But we know that at some point in the past, we didn't know if he had lied or not. In the passé composé, though, savoir describes a change from not knowing something to knowing something. And so again, a better translation might be to learn or find out. So, j'ai su qu'il s'appelait Jean is probably best translated as I found out that he was called John. I went from not knowing that he was called John to knowing that he was called John. If it's not clear why we're using il s'appelait instead of il s'est appelé, remember he's been called John his entire life. So that is again an ambiguous period of time from his birth to some point in the past that we're not interested in. But the j'ai su part suggests that I found out. And similarly, nous avons su qu'il avait menti. This time is we learnt, or we found out that he had lied. We went from not knowing to knowing. So we discovered, we found out, we learnt that he had lied. Then we have connaître, which in English translates normally to know as well. I'm hoping you kind of have a good idea of the difference between savoir and connaître, as I said before. If not, look at those in a little bit more detail before you try too hard to grasp all of this. In the imperfect, connaître refers to something or someone that you used to know, quite simply. So, je la connaissais quand j'étais à l'école. I knew her when I was at school. So, when I was at school is quite an ambiguous time period. We don't know whether it was from the start to the end, from the middle to the end, from the middle to another point in the middle. We don't know. It's just at some point when I was at school, I knew her. So we have two instances of the passé composé. Likewise, we could say elle ne me connaissait pas, and that would be she didn't know me at some ambiguous, undefined point in the past. Connaître in the passé composé has more the meaning of met. So you didn't know someone and then you did. So it's very similar to savoir, as savoir and connaître both often are, but with connaître, the meaning in the passé composé is met. So je l'ai connue à l'école is I met her at school. And elle ne m'a pas connu is she didn't meet me. Vouloir, which means to want, in the imperfect describes a general desire which wasn't necessarily acted upon. Again, we don't know whether we acted upon this, and we don't really care. The point is, at some point in the past, something was wanted. So, je voulais quitter la ville is I wanted to leave the city, and that's it. It's just my desire at some point in the past. We don't know whether I acted upon that or not. Similarly, ils voulaient nous aider is they wanted to help us, but whether they did or not is not important. Okay, the fact is that at some point they had the desire to help us. Used in the passé composé, though, vouloir suggests that the desire was acted upon, and so the meaning becomes more like tried. And I remember learning this and thinking, but why? I don't quite understand. Why does vouloir become try? But the point is very similar to what we've already seen. It's a case of whether something was acted upon. And if you want to do something and then you act upon it, you try. Right? So, j'ai voulu quitter la ville is I tried to leave the city. I.e., I wanted to, and I made the effort to. The implication perhaps being that I then failed. So you could say I tried to leave the city, but the giant guarding the gates wouldn't let me. That's kind of the implication. Well, there's no implication of giants, but the point is that at some point I was thwarted. Similarly, ils ont voulu nous aider is both they wanted to help us and they acted upon that. So they tried to help us. Devoir, as you may already know, means to have to, and in the imperfect denotes a necessity that, again, you may or may not have acted upon. So, je devais faire les courses is just a description of the fact that at some point in the past you had to go shopping. We don't know whether you did it or not, but that's not important. And similarly, on devait faire nos devoirs, again, we had to do our homework, but whether we did or not is not important. If you use it in the passé composé, though, it suggests that the duty was carried out. So this time we don't really have a change in meaning, but a change in nuance, right? Whether it was acted upon or not. So, j'ai dû faire les courses is I had to go shopping, and I did. And on a dû faire nos devoirs, we had to do our homework, and indeed, we did. And then finally we have pouvoir, which is very, very similar again. In the imperfect, it means that something was possible, but it wasn't necessarily done. We don't know, and we almost don't really care. So, il pouvait réparer la voiture is he could fix the car. He was able to fix the car. He had all the tools. He had the knowledge. Whether he did or not is not important. Il pouvait résoudre le problème. Again, they could solve the problem, but maybe they didn't. Maybe they did, maybe they didn't. We don't really care. We just know at some point in the past they were able to. In the passé composé, pouvoir indicates that the action was both possible and acted upon. Okay, it's very similar to the example of devoir that we've seen before. So, il a pu réparer la voiture is not just he was able to, but he did it. Okay, he was able to fix the car. He did so successfully. Similarly, ils ont pu résoudre le problème. They were able to solve the problem. So again, it was possible for them, and they did. And I think in English we almost have this distinction. Feel free to disagree, but I think if you say they could solve the problem, that perhaps suggests again that they were able to but didn't necessarily do it, whereas they were able suggests that they had the capacity and they did so successfully. That's just my thought. It might be a little bit influenced by the French, but I think if there's any equivalencies to be made here, then that's maybe one of them, but feel free to disagree. That's really not important. The point is that if you use the pouvoir in the passé composé, you suggest that something was possible and that possibility was acted upon. Without meaning to undo everything I've just told you, do remember that these meanings are only implicit. So j'ai su, though it often translates more appropriately to I learnt or I found out, doesn't automatically mean that. At the end of the day, you are still using the verb savoir. So sometimes it's just a case of thinking about it logically and thinking which is the best translation here. So, je n'ai jamais voulu aller à Paris doesn't mean I've never tried to go to Paris. We don't assume that voulu always means tried. This is a simple case of I have never wanted to go to Paris. And in any sentence with that kind of structure, I have never seen, I have never been, I have never tried, whatever it may be, you're going to use the passé composé. So that's a structural issue. On the other hand, there's the case of il a eu un accident. So previously we learned that avoir in the passé composé often expresses receiving or getting something, but this is obviously not he received an accident. That's a little bit odd. Your best translation here would be he had an accident. The reason we're using the passé composé is because he's no longer having this accident. It is over. It has a start and end point, and there we go. He had an accident at a specific point in time. So this is really just a case of thinking logically. I mean, il a eu un accident, he received an accident, makes no sense. So of course you will say he had an accident. Je n'ai pas su quoi faire. So this is I didn't learn what to do. If you wanted to say learn in this case, you would use apprendre, the verb for learn. This, of course, is I didn't know what to do in that specific moment. So again, we're referring to a specific point in time which is now over. And so you can indeed say je n'ai pas su quoi faire without it meaning to learn or to find out. So, as always, I think these things are best explained with examples, and we have looked at a lot of examples, but I want to do a few more, perhaps a few more everyday kind of sentences, full sentences as well. So I've got a couple of little exercises. I'll pause a little bit between the questions and the answers, but I suggest that you do pause the video if you need a little bit more time. So first of all, let's have a look at these two sentences. Il a plu et j'ai eu un accident, and il pleuvait et j'ai eu un accident. So these may well translate the same way in English. I don't know, that's up to you to figure that out. But my question to you is, in each of these sentences, was it raining when I had the accident? Have a think, and then come back and I'll give you the answer. So the answer for il a plu et j'ai eu un accident is no. It was not raining. The passé composé describes a completed action. So if we say il a plu, the rain has finished. This instead is a series of individual events. It rained and I had an accident. There may be an implication of cause and effect, i.e. it rained and because of the rain I had an accident, but these are two distinct actions. One happened at a different time to the other. On the other hand, in the case of il pleuvait et j'ai eu un accident, yes, it was raining when I had the accident, because remember, the Imparfait describes and sets the scene. It was raining, il pleuvait, and at the same time, j'ai eu un accident, I had an accident. We're not going to say j'avais un accident, that would be it was raining and I was having an accident, as if the two things just happened to be happening at the same time. No, this is set the scene with il pleuvait, and then say what happened, j'ai eu un accident. Okay. How would you say, when we lived in Nice, we would go to the beach every day? When we lived in Nice, we would go to the beach every day. For me, the best translation of this sentence is quand nous habitions à Nice, nous allions à la plage tous les jours. Quand nous habitions à Nice, nous allions à la plage tous les jours. Of course, you could have used on. Quand on habitait à Nice, on allait à la plage tous les jours. But the choice of nous versus on here is not important. The point is that both verbs habiter and aller here are in the imperfect. When we lived in Nice in the past for an undefined period of time, we would go to the beach every day. Don't think it's a conditional. Okay, this is a regular action in the past. Every day we went to the beach. So A, the use of would in that sense of habitual action, but also the use of tous les jours. Remember earlier on we spoke about those triggers. Tous les jours is a trigger of the imperfect. So in both of these clauses you need an imperfect. How about I went to the beach twice last week? This, on the other hand, would be je suis allé 2 fois à la plage la semaine dernière. Je suis allé because you said how many times you went. 2 fois. Okay, there you go. It's as simple as that. It's two individual events. How about this one? Il a dû revenir parce qu'il avait oublié quelque chose. And il devait revenir parce qu'il avait oublié quelque chose. So, can you tell me, in each of these sentences, did he come back? In the case of il a dû revenir, yes, he did. Remember that devoir in the passé composé implies that the state was acted upon. So not only did he have to, but he did come back, because he had forgotten something. On the other hand, il devait revenir parce qu'il avait oublié quelque chose gives us no information about whether he came back or not. We simply know that at some point in the past, it was his duty to come back. Whether he did or not is not important in this sentence. Now I'm going to give you two sentences and I want you to tell me which is the most appropriate. Je ne suis pas venu parce que j'ai été malade. And je ne suis pas venu parce que j'étais malade. Okay, so you could argue with these ones. You could suggest that both are possible, and indeed they are. They're both grammatical, and you could create some kind of context where they're both perfectly acceptable. But for me, the better translation here is the second one. Je ne suis pas venu parce que j'étais malade. Why is that? Well, the fact that I was ill is a description. I'm describing a past version of myself as ill. So you could go with the description versus narration definition. Secondly, being ill and not coming happened at the same time. So this goes back to the idea of a story again. The imperfect sets the scene. Time does not pass when we use the imperfect. It's just a description of what's going on. And I didn't come when I was ill. Okay, they happened at the same time, and so for me the imperfect is better there. And finally, parce que j'ai été malade, aside from being a little bit grammatically weird in this case, which I'll go into in a minute, suggests that you didn't come because you had previously been ill. So let's set up the scene a little bit to make that a little bit clearer. Let's say you were ill on Monday, and then you recovered on Tuesday. We know that you're no longer ill because you're using the passé composé. So your illness is over, and then let's say on Thursday you were going to go to a party, but you didn't go to it because you had been ill on the Monday. Now, I can think of a situation where that might be the case. Perhaps you had an infection, you were contagious, and you didn't want to risk spreading it to other people, even though you felt better. Fine, but then in that case, it would be better to use the plus que parfait. You would say, je ne suis pas venu parce que j'avais été malade, because you have an action in the past, me not coming, and one that's further in the past, being ill. Being ill happened before not coming, and so you've got one action further in the past than the other, and the one that's further on in the past uses the plus que parfait. If you understand the plus que parfait, that should be relatively clear. If you don't, that might be a jumble of random words. Don't worry too much, I'm just trying to sort of solve the problem of this strange translation. The point is that j'étais malade is a description and it happened the same time as me not coming, and therefore it would be better to say je ne suis pas venu parce que j'étais malade. And there we go, we have reached the end. If you watch this video from start to finish, I commend you, that's very, very impressive. Hopefully these explanations have been useful. I've tried to explain things in as much detail as possible. There may well be other situations that you come across and you're still not quite sure, perhaps because you can't quite get your head around how to think about it. That's fine. Ask someone, put it in the comments if you want to. Also, don't worry about it too much. If you get it wrong, it won't be a problem. I've got it wrong on many occasions and people still understand. And it's something that takes time. This, for me, is not something that I learnt by watching one whole video. It's something that gets easier the more you do it and the more you kind of get your head around it. I've tried my best to explain the things that I've spent a lot of years trying to figure out on my own, so hopefully that makes it a little bit easier. But remember that practice makes perfect. Time will make this sink in a little bit more as long as you keep with it. Of course, if you have any questions, please do let me know. If you want me to do anything more specific, or if you want me to cover another aspect that I've not covered in this video, let me know. That's absolutely fine. And until next time, à bientôt.